Dustin Strydom is the Vice President of Commercial Affairs at Smile ID. It's a company that recently released the 2025 Digital Identity Fraud in Africa report. Makes for fairly interesting reading. He's joining us now from Cape Town. So, Dustin, good to have you on the program. I want to start with a slightly different tangent, though. We're increasingly using, right, biometric verifications in the workplace, online, including authorizing access to accounts with fingerprints, facial scans, and so on. But for the average user, how vulnerable are these data points?
Well, thanks so much for having me. I think just first of all, I think the important thing to recognize is that biometric verifications are actually helping to make digital platforms much safer, right? So traditionally, what we saw was mostly unsophisticated fraud where fraudsters would try and get hold of someone's identity information to impersonate them. And without things like biometric verification, this was relatively easy to do. But we've seen a huge adoption in biometric verification and biometric authentication in the past year, which is shown in our report, which means that many businesses are actually stepping up their defenses to try and combat this fraud. And we've seen as a result a huge reduction in unsophisticated fraud. Now, of course, individuals need to remain vigilant. These tools can be used by fraudsters as well to obtain their personal information. So the average user really needs to be mindful of these threats that exist and think very carefully when asked to provide any personal information, including their biometrics. So the key reason why we got this report is to really educate not just the industry, but the individual users of digital platforms themselves so that they can be better prepared with these types of potential threats.
On the biometric fraud element of this study, one of the things that stood out for me is that you're saying that, the fraud side of it has gone up to a quarterly average of around 16%. Given everything that you've said, right, we're trying to essentially get more fingerprints, more facial scans to verify whether the person who has this document is actually the real beneficial owner of them. What's the most common way in which people are trying to game these systems now?
Well, yeah, as you rightly pointed out, biometric fraud's increased to the highest level we've seen in 3 years, which really shows that fraudsters are evolving and adapting to try and game digital platforms. And they're becoming far more sophisticated at that as well. The biggest impact that this has caused that's caused this is the rise of generative AI tools that are now widely available to everyone at very much little to no cost. And fraudsters are using these types of tools to create things like lifelike ID documents, photos, and videos at significant scale to impersonate the interactions that a user might have when going through a biometric verification process. So we've seen a rise in things like identity farming, where fraudsters look to obtain large quantities of personal information, including things like photos through illegal or unethical means, and an increase in things like insider-assisted fraud, which involves collaboration between fraudsters and individuals with privileged access to things like internal systems to try and commit fraud. Now, the combination of these widely available generative AI tools, identity data, and in some instances, some insider assistance really gives fraudsters the ability to create highly sophisticated fraud attempts.
Indeed, and incidents using deepfakes, apparently, according to your study, also went up a fair bit. Can you give us a sense of what tech is being used to create these deepfakes? Because we've seen some remarkably lifelike deepfakes, right, running around all over the internet. There was one, I believe, last year where the Russian president was holding his annual press conference, and there was a student, I think, in St. Petersburg who essentially created a deepfake of him to ask him a question. So where are you seeing these systems being deployed? Is it mostly in the financial sector, or is it elsewhere?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think like what's driving this really is the significant advancements in generative AI, right? And there are a plethora of generative AI tools out there that are available to pretty much anyone with an internet connection to create those types of videos that you would have seen. But the important thing to note is that there are actually tools capable of catching and detecting these attacks, right? Technology known as things like dynamic liveness, which combines unpredictability with real-time analysis to stop deepfakes at the source. Now, where we're seeing most of these attacks is most affected industries are typically the digital banks and micro lenders across the continent. And we're seeing significant rates across mostly West Africa, where we've seen biometric fraud attempts increase to alarming rates of up to 15%, up from just 5% in 2023. And many of those attempts are actually deepfakes. And then second to that, we've seen significant high recorded biometric and document fraud in East Africa, reaching levels of about 27% in 2024. So it really is significant and alarming. But the important thing to note is that there are tools out there that you can use to actually detect these types of attempts.
Indeed. The arms race does continue. Dustin Strydom from Smile ID, thank you very much. Now let's head over to Togo.